Hello, everybody. This is the Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for July 30th, 2020. Thank you all for coming, and please abide by our code of conduct, which in brief means be respectful and kind to one another. We have a relatively short agenda. We'll see if that actually pans out into a short discussion, but we have a short agenda anyway. To start, Wojtek, do you want to discuss SIG reliability?
Yeah, thanks, John. So I wanted to discuss the aspect of reliability. I think that we basically are doing or started doing a couple different things towards improving reliability or in quality bar and Kubernetes in general. Things like production readiness sub-project that we are driving, it has exactly that goal. But I think there are still things that we are not really investing into and not really doing much around. Things like different kinds of testing, in particular soak testing that is uncovering different things. We don't pretty much have any soak testing. Like the longest tests that are currently running are like scalability test, which takes 12 hours-ish. And we are targeting to actually shortening them significantly and speeding them up. So it will be even worse from that perspective. We don't really have very good upgrade testing. We were like, as part of production readiness, we were trying to, or we were thinking about like enforcing or having an upgrade test or rollback test to be actually a prerequisite to be promoted to either beta or GA. But like, given we don't really have like good infrastructure for upgrade testing, nor like we don't have really good examples of those that we can point people at to try to come up with like their own like upgrade testing. We decided we are not ready for that. We don't really have good chaos testing. There are some initiatives that help like hardening Kubernetes itself with, for example, like priority and fairness, but there aren't that many examples of those things that are happening, and I'm pretty sure we can be doing more of such things. Yeah, so I wanted to discuss like, so what I started thinking about is like maybe we should have like SIG reliability or reliability working group or something like that that will focus more on those problems and produce some more holistic vision or strategy of what are the things and like what are the things that we should be investing and what are the relative priorities. But obviously, like as mentioned in the email thread by different people, I think I also mentioned some drawbacks in my initial email, but like more were mentioned later. This has some drawbacks, so I generally wanted to start this discussion and hear your thoughts about like what can we do, whether things like dedicated group really make sense, or if we can do something to empower people to do that work somehow. Because unfortunately, most of those examples that I gave is not super fancy work. It's not like super easy to attract people to look into soak tests and try to debug why they are failing. So yeah, I just basically wanted to kick this discussion and hear your thoughts. I don't have any like even half-baked solution. I just wanted to start discussing it. So
Anybody that has thoughts on this, please jump in. There has been some discussion on the mailing list, and like Wojciech said, there's concern over overhead, but I mean, a working group might be a better strategy to put together. The exit criteria would have to be like, you know, there's a framework in place for the upgrade tests. There's a framework in place for the chaos tests. And if there's anything, those would eventually be owned by SIG testing, I would think. But like, you know, a working group that's might be an approach to kind of put in place the infrastructure and the process and automation associated with it in order to kind of make it run on its own. But any other thoughts out there?
So what I am more interested in is who is a set of people, and I mean, I don't care whether it is a SIG or a working group because we can switch it around, and it's just getting the set of people together and getting them working on the problem and making sure that they have enough support from the rest of us. That is what worries me more than actually whether, do we have to write a charter, is it a SIG, that kind of stuff, YTech. So at this point, the scalability team has been leading the charge in terms of like making all these awesome things happen. And I'm like a little bit worried that there isn't enough of us from the other vendors and other companies helping out with the scalability stuff. So if
Yeah,
it
I
comes
think. Sorry, go ahead.
if it comes to reliability, then what kind of skills are you looking for in other teams, other companies, and how would they be able to help with the initiative? That is basically what we need to articulate, and we need to get people to sign on, so to say. So to say, okay, yes, I'm interested in this problem. I'm interested in working this with you all. That is basically the bootstrapping is the problem at this point, I feel.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So, from one hand, like I think there are like people from very different skill sets will be needed here. Like on one hand, ideally there should be people who are managing different, or ideally many different clusters. In particular, like people from like cloud provider companies probably would be good because they've seen a bunch of those different reliability issues, so can contribute to prioritizing what is important, what is probably not that super important at this point and can be like moved to the future, or maybe things that are just one-offs and aren't worth investing at all. Ideally, we should have some people from with more reliability or site, like SREs or site reliability engineers, like who are responsible for running those systems in production or for managing the clusters in their own companies or whatever, like that reliability issues are directly hitting them, that people that are performing upgrades, for example, and like are dealing with the issues that this is causing. But we also need like people from different SIGs. In particular, like test, yeah, actually Jordan just pasted to the chat a list of 6, which is pretty much roughly what I had on my mind. To actually do the real work around like providing frameworks to actuate those. So I think we have, and we probably need a bunch of people who will actually be executing on those. Like once we come up with some design for upgrade upgrade test framework, someone needs to do the real work and implement that. So probably we probably should start with like more senior people to come up with like the agenda and strategy and design, or at least high level designs for or high level requirements, stuff like that for different things. But like we later then we definitely would need more people actually doing the coding and stuff like that. But yeah, it's not super well thought through, at least by me. So I just wanted to start this discussion.
I mean, I think that the root of it is how we recruit people, or like, so with the PRR stuff, maybe there's more we could do to recruit people there too. But we started out in the beginning, there was some interest. There were maybe a dozen to 15 people who showed up to the first few meetings, and interest waned, and now it's me and David Eads and Wojtek, and like, right, so, and none of us are SREs. So like, right, like, how do we get people who live this on a day-to-day basis, and maybe they're too busy fighting fires? Like, so that's my, I think Dim said it first, but that's my biggest concern too, is how we sustainably staff this from a bunch of volunteers.
I was just going to say that, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jordan. Go ahead, Jordan.
These are not new issues. These have been raised for years at this point. I think there is sort of general agreement that these things are important, but then not specific agreement that they are more important than a particular feature or thing in a given release. I also think that talking about adding more tests when the tests we already have are not a good signal is difficult to sort of scope and plan and execute on, when a lot of the people that would have input on that are trying to wrangle our current issues. I feel like a sort of stack rank of quality issues that need addressing is maybe a first step. Like, and we're sort of doing that already with the existing tests. Putting these in the mix and then saying, where do these compare to feature work? Is it reasonable to continue with feature work plans when we don't actually have things that demonstrate you can upgrade successfully? And so just sort of like very coarse-grained, like, we need reliable CI infrastructure. Our existing tests need to be giving us good signal. Here are tests we don't have at all: chaos, soak, upgrade. And then pulling in SIG leads and saying, look, this is where we're at. We think until these things are addressed, we should not be doing more feature work because we aren't confident in the system we already have. That at least sets out, we have chaos, that's great. That at least gives us sort of broad goals. Then we can stack rank those and start breaking them down and figuring out like which SIGs are involved in each of those. So the list of SIGs that I put at the top, I agree, Walter, like there are lots of individual component SIGs that are gonna need to be involved, but the ones I called off just at the top were sort of the ones that we need to even get the framework and the enforcement and the goals stated before we even get to like, all right, we're seeing a problem with this component and that SIG owns it, so let's dig in with them and figure out how to fix it. All right, I'm done.
So can I have quick follow-up to what you said, Jordan? So does it make sense to like park it for like a couple more weeks until we are in better shape with respect to like existing tests and stuff like that, and get back to what you suggested, which is like taking together leads of those SIGs and try to come up with the list of things that are missing and try to come up with some priorities across them in the next, like, I don't know, in a month or 2 months or whatever, whenever we are. I can't hear you. I don't know if I'm just...
Sorry. Without going into too much detail, I would start the conversation now and just say, like, CI infrastructure stabilization, and CI test stabilization are two efforts that are getting a lot of attention now. But if we don't start the conversation about SOAK chaos upgrade tests that we don't have at all, the assumption will be that once I don't see flaky tests for my SIG anymore, then I can just barrel ahead with 120 dev work. And so if we want this to get attention in the next release, I think we need to start that conversation now, at least in general. And it might be the case that some of those tests aren't going to be available for SIGs to work on this release, but others would. So asking them, like, are there things, do you have components that need SOAK tests? If so, do you have those? Those seem like the most reasonable ones to run because you don't need a lot of complicated like upgrade, downgrade. You don't need new frameworks really. You just need like a long running test that takes a well-known thing that is known to behave well and just runs it and then checks something at the end. Like that's a pretty simple test to write.
Yeah, this is just speaking in broad strokes, this is definitely an area we want to get like involved in both like upgrade testing, because we have a lot of investment obviously that we want to make sure it works well, just like everyone else does. But I think we just organizationally we probably, for us to get best involved, we will need help in terms of just saying, hey, here's work to do. So like it's going to be not probably for this release, but we definitely want to be part of this conversation and be involved in that.
That's great. More people involved is better. I guess Jordan, and I think Tim said something about this in the email chain, but I mean, it sounds like you're saying maybe not. Internally we would do something like, oh, we're stopping feature work until we fix all this stuff, right? And we can't really do that in an open source project, but we can encourage. Like, are you suggesting, Jordan, that we essentially try to again make 120 a fixed release or test like a reliability release? And try to encourage SIGs to focus on those things rather than function, rather than features. Are you going that far?
I think that should be the top priority. Like Walter says, or Dim says, it's a short release anyway.
Right.
And given the current state of CI, it seems entirely plausible to me that it could be consumed with test quality, stability, bug fix improvements. Historically, the let's have a stability release proposal kind of got objected to because it's like, well, what if some SIGs are in super great shape? And I don't know that I don't know that any SIGs are in super great shape right now. Maybe there are some, but even SIGs that don't have flaky tests. So like SIG auth doesn't have flaky tests generally, but some of the test categories that were identified as being missing, like SOAK tests, scale tests, there are components I know of that don't have tests exercising those things. So rather than saying 120 is a stability release and you may not do feature work in it, I think it's more reasonable to say, like, if all of these categories you have coverage for and like good signal for, and you have capacity, then it's reasonable to do feature work. But if you don't, then work on those things first.
So what that's going to require, I mean, for SOAK, like you said, those we maybe don't need. There's not a lot of, well, SIG testing or is going to have to run a SOAK test, and so there's going to have to be some, at least, coordination there's going to have to be some, if we're going to do chaos testing, there's going to have to be some mechanism. Like we're going to have to give SIGs enough guidance if we want to do this. And the concern I have is that in the next 3 weeks, are we going to have enough time to ramp up that guidance to make it productive for people?
Yeah, the upgrade tests seem like the one that is least well defined. Flaky tests, failing test jobs, missing soak and chaos tests, those all seem like things that SIGs could execute on more or less now.
Ironically, the upgrade tests are actually one of the more reliable bits of useful testing. They're not very comprehensive, but we've been running them for, like in OpenShift, we've been heavily relying on them, and I don't actually think I've seen a flake out of them. So I think it's more a coverage problem on upgrade, and we can debate how far we go.
Yeah.
I think Walter, you had raised a hand. Is he next?
Yeah, I mean, just a few things I wanted to follow up on, but one, starting with what Jordan said, I think the earlier we discuss get what we need, and I think we do need all the SIGs involved, because I think many of the SIGs have individual perspectives on their area of code and what's missing in terms of coverage, etc. So, I mean, as an example, I know the API server, API machinery code has some interesting problems I think multiple cloud providers have seen now with what happens when the API server goes down, comes back up under a larger cluster. We tend to get things like watch storms in the API server not being able to make it back up again. And it's probably chaos testing, but I still think that this sort of indicates that we should be involving all the SIGs, getting them involved early, because they know their code, they know the problems they tend to see, and they may also have ideas about how the testing and how the fixes should work. And the sooner we do that, the better. The other thing I'll say is when we talk about, reliability release, and this is my opinion, but I think just about every SIG is probably suffering significantly in their velocity based on our lack of reliability. So if we want to do more feature work, I think the best way of doing more feature work is working out what the stumbling blocks are and removing them. And that comes down to making the tests reliable and adding tests for things that we end up spending a lot of time on. And most of the individual SIGs know, oh yeah, going back to the API machinery, like probably everyone has had to on the cloud provider side at least, has had the experience of debugging and working out how to move forward under watch storms or under something like various bad webhook configurations, and we spend multiple SIG meetings doing nothing but talking about those things but not moving forwards. And so I think getting more tests in those areas is actually going to allow us to move faster. And I've touched enough other SIGs that I think, every SIG has that list. I've certainly seen with things like the Node team, like the fact that Node tends to fall over if the main storage gets slow, right? We have this long list of things, and I think if we focused on getting that better, we could move faster as an entire organization.
Okay, thank you, Walter. All right, well, it sounds like there's general agreement on this idea of at least, well, I don't know what the idea for SIG reliability, but the general agreement on the idea for improving reliability, and in particular, trying to focus on some of these issues that Wojtek's raised in the 120 timeframe. So I guess what I would ask is what our next steps are here. Maybe Wojtek, as the champion of this, would you like to maybe send out a suggestion to the SIG leads mailing list, or how should we proceed?
So I will try to put some doc with suggestions like in the next week or so, and share it with like SIG architecture first, maybe for input. and then we can decide like whether it's reasonable or not, and proceed with like broadcasting it more widely. Does it make sense?
So just let's start this as a working group, just so because we are talking about like getting people from different SIGs. So let's start this as a working group model. If we need to change, we'll change. And then we'll basically tell the SIGs that each of them will have to have a liaison to this group, this working group, right? That's one way of trying to get people. I don't know how many people will show up actually, but then we have to say something, right? And so what we would say is each SIG should send somebody to this working group, because this working group is where we're going to try to fix some of these problems. That's the only thing I can think of, other than usual send out the emails and see who shows up. But on a slightly tangential basis, we haven't really had a strong, what in OpenStack we used to call the operators. Operators are in OpenStack language was the people who are running clouds. We don't have that here. We just have. Hey, Brad. Do you want to talk about operators there? No.
You're doing a great job. I just want. No, I was listening.
Yeah, so we used to have a strong operators group. Like, for example, the leads were like from CERN, CERN, and they used to run big clouds, right? And then they would do it on their own hardware, and they would be advocating for the things that they would like to do. They would go to each SIG and say, "Oh, this is bullshit. This is not working fine. This is not, you got to do this better." So we don't have that. We just have developers, and like John was saying, we have like volunteers who are trying to do some of this stuff. But and the thing with the operators was they would trade tips with each other, saying, "Okay, they would exchange patches and things like that too, and they would come up with these versions of things that they run. So they would compare versions, and they had their own meetups and things like that too. So at some point we have to try to do that, where we are inviting SREs and people like that who are running clouds.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, one of the things that we do have is the CNCF has a user, what do they call it? I don't know, user committee or work group or something.
User
right?
community, I think.
Yeah, and they have a set of companies, probably which, mostly are Kubernetes users, that at least are interested enough to show up there. And I wonder if there's user representation of the governing board also. So I'm wondering if that would be a place to go and say, hey, we're trying to solicit more operators of clusters. Obviously there's the cloud providers represented on this call, and those of us who are in that space see thousands of clusters, but nonetheless, it could be useful to get other customer input too. And I know certainly we are seeing more involvement from some users.
So Wojtek, I'll help you find links or contacts or emails, mailing lists, that kind of stuff to spread the word. But then we need to get the information ready that we would like to send to them.
So
sure, yeah, I will try to start it at least, and then we can incorporate or gather your feedback before we start sending it wider. Yeah.
Okay. So to try and wrap this up, so we have time for the other agenda items. It sounds like there's two things in my mind. See if this matches what other people think. One is the working group, and that's sort of how we organize the effort. But the other is actually the 120 release and encouraging and/or encouraging, I guess, is the best we can do. SIGs to focus on test coverage, test flakiness, test potentially types of tests. So those are two kind of separate threads I think we need to track. Is that Wojtek and Dims? Are you guys on that? Okay, thank you.
I don't know what I have to do, but I'm ready for it.
Okay, Wojtek, are you on that? And you'll work with Tim for what he just offered to help with?
Yeah, I'm also not sure like how successful we will be this time, but I think it's worth trying at least.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, thank you, everyone. Let's wrap that one up because we're already halfway through our time. And I believe the next thing is Srini on the profile stuff. Did you or Brad want to jump in on that?
Sure, absolutely, John. This is in reference to some comments that are on, the community 4994. If people are have access to that, but we put in our comment, John, and then you put in your comment with regards to, yeah, maybe you're right. We got to do a little more work here. Again, profiles are great, but there's still got to be that piece that says, hey, all you cloud providers, let's go see which of these profiles you can actually support. And ideally, you all support the same subset if that's what we need, right? Because if all the providers go support different subsets of profiles, well, we've just destroyed conformance and the spirit of it that we started March 2017. So this was just hey, let's not forget about the real key to this, making this successful, which is if you're going to start building profiles, we got to have that process or mechanism to start seeing, hey, who can support which profiles. And maybe there's a provider's like, well, I'm one short, but I think I can get there. And that was sort of the spirit of what we started Conformance in 2017, is driving everybody to supporting the same things, as opposed to potentially taking off the guardrails and people, support any profile they want. And next thing you know, we have everybody's favorite flavor of Kubernetes that doesn't quite interoperate. And then, so John, you responded, and I thought, your response was spot on. It recognized the issues, similar to what Dim's mentioned about having, operator-based stakeholders. Having a good understanding of who thinks they need what as a profile is kind of a good start. Do we have people knocking down on our door saying, you got to make this a profile. This wasn't in the base stuff, and I really need this. And every provider of my equivalence class, and the only one that comes to mind, is, just for no better example, would be, say, cloud providers. Ideally, the cloud providers are an equivalence class that all provide the same groups of profiles, so that the end user still thinks they're getting a wonderful, interoperable, portable workload experience. And, we just wanted to get that on the SIG agenda to make sure that they were, aware of the concerns there from the original work. I don't know how many of the folks here were around when we met on this in 2017 in March, when we started kicking off conformance and certification. But just to keep that, we had the guardrails on, John, to make sure we were still driving this in a way that really helps the end user in the community.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that what I ended up saying is based on the discussions we had earlier this week, as well as the comments on the PR. What my plan was right now is, I'm out next week, but before I go, I plan to write out just a short document, thoughts on conformance, that list some of the issues that have been raised, some of my thoughts, and as best I can represent others' thoughts. And then, next conformance meeting, which is a week from this coming Tuesday, we can review that and try to come up with some decisions. But what I don't want to happen is for us to just talk in circles, which is what's kind of happened in the past, because people, there's a lot of different opinions, and so it's not always clear what I don't think we've made really clear the goal. To me, the goal for profiles was to be able to increase coverage beyond things that we think aren't necessarily baseline, but I also don't want to create a POSIX Kubernetes that is so paltry that it's the standard is so useless that there's no compatibility at all guarantees because it's so minimal. So it's a difficult challenge. I guess if anybody else has comments on that, please speak up. Otherwise, we'll wait till next conformance meeting. Okay. Then Till, looks like you just added a question here.
Yes, this is mostly coming over from SIG release or from the Lumos people. And it's mainly, I never saw any notes past it from July 2nd. So I think it got dropped, mostly because I wasn't here to answer questions there. And the main question is, what does Kubernetes actually want in terms of hardware support? Is there some plan for a tiered support version, so only certain sub-features will be supported on certain OSs? Or do people want testing hardware to test out the full things every once in a while, or things like that? That was what I've caught up with the discussion also.
So if I can just maybe refresh on context here, if I recall correctly, the issue here was that we claim support for certain architectures that we don't actually have CI for, or the CI runs very rarely. Is that a correct memory?
Yes, that was one of the things, or yeah, basically that. And
Okay.
also the question is how to add more things to that, or will there be in the official releases or not?
I mean, strictly speaking, right, it makes sense to me if we didn't claim support for things that we don't have a good test signal on. Of course, as we discussed earlier, there's a lot of things we don't have a good test signal on that are fundamental. So, but this is at least one that's clear to. So, I guess I'm not sure on what we would do to get a clear signal other than working with, workgroup infra and testing to get whatever infrastructure we need and test setup we need to exercise those platforms. But if people want support for those, it's kind of, as an open source community, falls on those wanting support for those platforms to provide the infrastructure that we might need to do it.
So are you looking more like a support model like the Go team has, where the other OS provide infrastructure so you can test with an automated tester? Or more like the Rust team does it with tiers, where the individual OSs basically have a lower tier, so people just know there is something around that they need to contact the other OS team?
I have not given that any thought. I don't know if anybody else on the call has ideas about that.
I think this is there's a larger conversation here, right? Like people are asking for like changes in scripts and make files and Docker files about can I add support for different architectures, and it's like, so a while ago we made this effort to add PowerPC and ARM64 and S3 360, 390, one of the two, and stuff like that, right? So what we ended up doing was, I don't know how to replicate that again now with the newer architectures that are coming in, but it basically involves making sure that there is enough stuff in there so we would be able to run a conformance test, right? That was the outcome that we marched towards when we did that work. But now, if we have to do the same work, then what we are asking people to do is write a KEP, right? So we would have to have a KEP for an arch to say, these are the things that we would test, and this is how we would test it. That I would expect to be part of a KEP for a new arch that's coming in. And we would hold it to the same standard as we hold other things. If you want the arch to be officially blessed, then there should be a certain set of checklists that they need to mark on, including they should you should be able to run without a custom patch of Golang, or or a base image should be available for anybody to use, or there's a bunch of things that are involved there. So this comes into, basically this question comes back to that, like, we have to try it out with one of the arches, and I think the last we talked about was with the ARM team here. Tina was here. So it will come out of that discussion, I think.
Okay. Yeah. No, that sounds actually like a way forward. That sounds very good. Otherwise, I will be also available to try out if you want to try out the new things there.
So James, can I ask, just for my own curiosity, or to make sure I understand clearly? I mean, we can think of the different architecture support as different levels of support, in that, like, if a third party, if we don't, as a Kubernetes project, release blessed images or blessed binaries of a particular architecture, that doesn't preclude us from having makefiles that theoretically support that. Building in those, some third party could build in those, package that, and as long as they can pass the conformance tests along with making their images publicly available so that's reproducible, then that would be able to be considered a conformant Kubernetes.
Right. The yardstick that we had from the trademark processes, somebody else other than the vendor should be able to replicate that thing, right, what you did, right? So that would be the same yardstick that we would keep. Like, as long as there is enough information for somebody to be able to run a conformance test and submit the results, then we would say, thumbs up or thumbs down based on that, I think.
But we're not necessarily, like, in order for us to release official blessed images, then we would need proper test signal. But we, right. Okay.
Mika and then Jordan.
Jordan had his hand raised first.
Okay. I am not sure what we think about, like, having quote unquote support for a platform and adding build scripts, but not testing it, or not, like, saying that it works. It's also important to recognize the cost of that. Like, every additional platform we add to our tests and our builds and our, like, make the release for all platform scripts is, like, adds to release time. And then the last point is, if we have a platform that we don't have test coverage for, and we encounter some issue, like a build issue or a dependency issue or something like that, like, are we allowed to drop support for that untested, not officially supported platform in order to make progress on the platforms we do support and do test and do have to deliver?
Okay, so Mika goes next, but I'll wait for my turn.
Yeah, so James, I just had a question on what you were saying about, like, I think repeatability, and not just in terms of conformance, but were you talking about, like, builds too? Do they need to be like reproducible binaries, or?
Yeah, we didn't say reproducible binaries, as long as there is a way to recreate the whole scenario. So the latest problem, just from day before yesterday, was we were trying to build the Go 115.1, and we ran into a problem where we were using a Docker setup, which is inside Microsoft or some place, and it had filled up with the file system was full. Basically we had to wait for somebody to come and clean up. So that's just an example of it hurting the release process, and given a choice, Jordan, I would dump Windows. But right now, they don't even do plenty of the conformance tests that we have. So I don't know what to say there. Clayton?
I was gonna say, like, I think new architectures, if you can run the unit tests and the builds, like I think that we have to do something. Like, it's easier to have a better rule. It's like either to have a pretty broad rule, which is if you want to have code in the project, you have something that can test it. I could maybe buy that some architectures are going to be pretty constrained, and maybe we need to come up with a process for, like, oh, you can only run your tests every week. Or I don't think that's unreasonable if we had like a build environment and you could keep building, but maybe it was periodic and it was up to you. And if you didn't meet the criteria, you get kicked out and we delete the code, or we put you into maintenance mode. Running full suites, again, like I agree for Windows, this has been a struggle for a lot of the different things because implications are not obvious unless you can really stress them. And so I think just based on the past experience, I would encourage us to have a higher bar for new things coming in. It doesn't have to be an overwhelmingly high bar. Like, you don't have to run a PR test on every PR. You don't have to have 30 periodics. You don't have to have upgrade periodics. But you do have to show some level of investment, some level of support, and we should look for ways to make that scale.
So one thing about that, Clayton, if we have like very periodic or intermittent testing, it makes it very likely that releases, like security releases, will break those unsupported architectures.
If it's an unsupported architecture and your periodic doesn't run fast enough, and you care about security, you should pony up for testing. This will be different for every architect or every variant.
So just so I'm clear, are we describing the Kubernetes project distributing binaries, or are we just saying the build scripts would, if you built on like my architecture, Acme, whatever, like the build scripts won't choke. You can run those yourself, but we're not going to build and distribute those binaries.
I mean, it might be maybe we build and don't distribute. I do feel that the bar for distributing should be pretty high. That's completely reasonable. Nothing should block a release that has not ponied up for, like, you bring effort or you don't block the release. I think that could be like a rule or something, or the guideline.
I mean, I think that if we're distributing it, the project is distributing it, then we need test signal, right? And we need pretty good test signal. But what I was understanding earlier was that, is it possible to add, at the way you just said, is it possible to just add things to the build scripts that we're not even necessarily building, but it's up to some third party to build and distribute in their architecture? But yeah, then we certainly can't block the release. But if it's not part of our CI, it's not going to do that anyway. I mean, my experience with like in the OpenStack project that been brought up, like there was a third party CI, and it was not a great experience from my point of view as one of those third parties. I mean, you had a lot of, so every PR you'd get these third party CI triggered, and they would, they'd go offline, they'd get flaky, and so you ended up making them non-voting anyway, and then they would just go red, and they would stay red forever, and it was not a success. But maybe I was in the networking space, and in the networking space, I didn't see it as a particularly successful way of doing things. I don't know if other people had other experience with that, but that would be, that would be my concern. I think Walter and I talked before about a similar issue with cloud provider, right? As cloud provider spins out of tree, then how do you do the CI and all those different environments? It's not necessarily that easy.
Right. So, John, that we do have a similar one where we in test grid people can report results, and which is what ARM uses for example. So, just going back a little bit, of the 3 architectures that we added, I think the ARM turned out okay, the PowerPC turned out okay, because those people are actually engaging in many of the conversations around things that we are doing here. But the S390 folks never showed up. And I'm like, based on this conversation with Clayton, I would just stop, tell the release team to stop shipping S390 stuff, from our official releases, and let it be for on the make file and things like that. But then we do need to write it up.
If you can't even do that much, I don't think you should be part of the release. The ideal outcome is that people step up, and then we have some like working groups, right? We had working groups. We came in, we assigned a garbage collection policy for working groups. Let's have a garbage collection policy for supported architectures.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, Mika, you had a question. Do you want to share?
Yeah, I just dropped it in the chat too. Just maybe this might be some of my own lack of knowledge, but like what about like if say like a specific, not Kubernetes, but a dependent project, say Docker, SED, Cordiness, like what if there's an OS specific bug in one of those that requires, moving forward on that dependency or that other project, so that diverges from like the standard for just that OS architecture? Like, how do we think about that with conformance, and then also like, I don't know, testing?
So the trademark conformance thing doesn't really say that you should use our binaries, right? So technically,
right?
Yeah.
Not our binaries, but what about the versions, right? Like
we don't care about the versions either. All we look for is the names of the tests that were run and whether they were successful or not.
And we take
it's behavior driven. If you can run the test suite against the server and get the observed output, then
and we've pushed back pretty strongly even against like minor version. If you regress in a minor version, conformance is about trademark and meeting a bar and being able to keep it up at a periodic interval of 3 months or so, whatever the release cadence of Kubernetes is. It is not a more diligent, aggressive thing. Now, that said, when you're no longer conformant the next time around because you let your stuff atrophy, you'll make that mistake once.
Right. But then what is end up happening is Sonobuoy people are using to test if their clusters are healthy. So,
there are people who use it, who misuse it. It's not a quality measure. It's not a. It's simply a.
Wait, did we just say that our tests are not a quality measure? Does that go back to
our conformance tests? Conformance tests. I mean, right? Like, if you can, we're not gonna. It's not a soak test, right? Like, you're not gonna like. It runs. It's just about compatibility at the runtime and API layer.
John, he got you.
I do think the meta problem we are talking about is the raising the bar on quality testing as distinct from the other types of testing that we allegedly do in a more holistic manner. And that's the initiative that we're trying to drive up across all these fronts.
Okay, so it sounds like, if I can summarize, that well, I'm not sure what it sounds like. So maybe within the last couple of minutes, somebody else can summarize. But what I heard is that we clearly we need solid test signal if we're going to distribute any binaries. We need garbage collection process for architectures, so that if you're not maintaining your third-party CI, you're booted. I didn't get any clarity on whether we would accept a patch to our build script for an architecture that we don't have any way to build and or test against. That's the one I still wasn't clear on.
Yeah, I got to figure that out. I was on point to write that up, right? So, and this is additional material for me to incorporate. John.
Okay, that just trying to summarize what I understood the discussion to be, make sure that we're on the same page. So then, last call for any comments in the last 2-3 minutes here. Otherwise, I'll give you back all that extra time.
Yeah, just a quick question. Where would I find such a write-up about the garbage collection policies and things like that in these meeting notes, or a cap or a?
I don't think such a thing exists yet. So DIMS, is that
Yeah,
something?
we usually have a set of pages in community that we update. For example, our deprecation policy is there, so that's where we would add it when we come up with one.
Okay, so I will watch that space.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Interesting meeting. And have a great couple of weeks. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.